calm down from that pre-show because my goodness. Okay, guys, never do that again. Never, ever. Okay, so let's get into the news. So, in other bizarre and strange news, Stormy Daniels has now been arrested, and it's hilarious. Okay, so Stormy Daniels was arrested last night. Why? Well, it's sad when, the new Democratic leader is arrested. Everybody during the rallies in 2016 was shouting, lock her up about Hillary Clinton. And then Hillary Clinton became irrelevant. And now it turns out we're going to lock up the new Democratic leader, their leading 2020 candidate, Stormy Daniels. So here is the actual statement of fact in support of probable cause for the arrest of Stormy Daniels. At approximately 11:30 p.m., a dancer using the stage name Stormy Daniels, later identified as Stephanie Clifford, made her way to the main stage and began performing. The majority of the patrons got up from their tables and stood immediately adjacent to the stage, throwing dollar bills at Miss Clifford, which is a good metaphor for her entire career, as well as an actual non-metaphor for her entire career. During her performance, after removing her top, exposing her breasts, she began forcing the faces of the patrons into her chest and using her bare breasts to smack the patrons, which is a thing to do, I guess. The officers also observed Miss Clifford fondling the breasts of female patrons. As soon as the officers observed the aforementioned criminal activity, Detectives Lancaster, Keckley, and Prather approached the stage. Miss Clifford made her way over to Detective Keckley and began performing in front of her. Miss Clifford leaned over, grabbed Detective Keckley's head, and began smacking her face with her bare breasts and holding her face between her breasts against her chest. America is already great. Miss Clifford then began making her way over to Detective Lancaster and performed the same acts on him, forcing his face into her chest between her breasts and began smacking his face with her bare breasts. Miss Clifford then moved down onto the stage where Officer Prather was standing and began fondling Officer Prather's buttocks and breasts. She then forced Officer Prather's head into her chest between her breasts and began smacking Officer Prather's fist with her bare breasts, as she had done with all the other patrons and aforementioned officers. Well, it's like it's a Mason chain or something. During this time, Detective Rosser was standing back near the bar area witnessing the criminal activity. So Detective Rosser was the least lucky officer assigned that evening. As soon as Miss Clifford moved on from Officer Prather, Detective Rosser made his way through the crowd to advise the other officers he was exiting the club to request the assistance of patrol to arrest the aforementioned three suspects. All three suspects were arrested without incident. I'm not sure who the three suspects are. Is that Clifford and her breasts? Like, I'm confused. It is the aforementioned three suspects. This is poorly written. I'm not sure who the other people who are arrested are. All I can say here is that clearly the Democrats have chosen wisely in their decision to make Stephanie Clifford the leading edge of their attack on President Trump. She is nothing but class. Why would we ever suspect that she might, do things for money when she spent her entire career doing things for money? Why might we ever suspect that maybe this whole I'm a victim of the president and I will stop the president, I'm on Saturday Night Live to stop the president, then maybe that's all just a way to raise her profile because she's pretty much willing to smack people in the face with her boobs for cash. And that is not an exaggeration. That is literally her arrest record now, is that she smacked people in the face with her boobs for cash. And we are supposed to believe that she and her lawyer, Michael Avenatti, are going to save America. Well, I know that there are a lot of people on the right who believe that Trump is King David, so I guess that this would make her like female King David, according to the left, that like God anointed her breasts so that she can save the country from President Trump. Yes, everything is deeply stupid. Indeed, all of the things are stupid. And they're not just stupid with regard to Stormy Daniels' latest arrest for apparently bringing people face to face with the crevasse. Apparently also, Peter Strzok was interviewed by the House Judiciary and Oversight Committee today. And he has now returned to a congressional hearing room just down the hall. And he says that he was not biased against President Trump in any way. He did not bias his case against President Trump in any way, which is only belied by every fact we know about Peter Strzok at this time. He was the FBI agent, of course. He suggested that he was going to stop Trump from becoming president, was texting with his lover, Lisa Page. She's a delight. So is Lisa Page. Both of them married, having an affair with each other, and texting about how Trump was the worst thing in the world. Clearly, President Trump didn't have the moral standards of Peter Strzok and Lisa Page while they were cheating on their spouses with one another and then using their professional positions in order to accelerate an investigation into a political enemy. Clearly, Trump is the major problem here. Here is what Peter Strzok said in his testimony, quote, "Let me be clear, unequivocally and under oath. Not once in my 26 years of defending our nation did my personal opinions impact any official action I took." So all those texts about how you were going to stop President Trump using the best of your abilities, that was all just like weird nonsense, exactly. He says, "The fact is, after months of investigations, there is simply no evidence of bias in my professional actions." That is not what the Inspector General Michael Horowitz said in his report. He said there's actually pretty good evidence of Peter Strzok's bias in his professional actions. According to that Investigator General report, the Inspector General report, if you recall, he made the case that Peter Strzok, who was in charge of both the Hillary Clinton email investigation and the Russia investigation, had basically delayed the Hillary email investigation because he thought the Russia investigation was more important. Horowitz himself suggested that he could not find that Strzok was free of bias. Thursday's hearing is poised to be one of the most contentious in Congress so far tied to the Russia investigation, according to CNN. Trey Gowdy says the moment special counsel Bob Mueller found out about Peter Strzok's texts and emails, he kicked him off the investigation. That was a year and a half too late. The texts and emails may have been discovered in May of 2017, but the bias existed and was manifest a year and a half before that, all the way back to late 2015 and early 2016. So it wasn't the discovery of the text that got him fired. It was the bias manifest in those texts. Strzok instead said, quote, "In the summer of 2016, I was one of a handful of people who knew the details of Russian election interference and its possible connections with members of the Trump campaign. This information had the potential to derail and quite possibly defeat Mr. Trump, but the thought of expressing that or exposing that information never crossed my mind." Now, as I pointed out, I think this is a somewhat decent defense that if Strzok was really out to get Trump, why didn't he just reveal to the world that Trump was under investigation in this collusion investigation? But the counter argument, which I think is not uncredible, is that Strzok didn't want to break the law. By leaking, he would have been breaking the law. He didn't want to put his own career at risk. He just figured if I accelerate the investigation, then eventually Trump is going to be found guilty before the election and we will be fine, right? And then Trump will be stopped from being president. Trump, of course, has tweeted consistently about Strzok. There's a good shot that Strzok is going to be held in contempt of Congress because he isn't answering questions now. And that would not be any sort of giant shock at this point. Okay, so while all of these scandals are a brewing, while Stormy Daniels faces time behind bars where she will, I'm sure, film her latest lesbian pornography act, and where President Trump is fighting off Peter Strzok, meanwhile, President Trump is over at NATO. And controversy has broken out over at NATO because the president has been very harsh with our NATO allies. So as I discussed yesterday, he made two specific claims, neither of which was completely unfounded. Specific claim number one is that all of these countries in NATO pledged in 2014 that they were going to increase the percentage of GDP that they spent on their national defense all the way up to 2%. And only 4 countries have done so as of 2017. Out of the 26 NATO countries, only 4 have done so at this juncture. Now, many more will do so in the coming years. And it's not that we are picking up the bill for them. It's not as though we have raised our own defense spending to make up for European lack of defense spending. We have our defense spending. They have their defense spending. It's really their problem. But Trump isn't wrong when he says, you guys made a promise. You ought to spend more on your defense. And if you're spending nothing on your defense and then you expect us to come to your rescue if you're attacked, you know, we are going to come to your rescue if you're attacked, but you need to raise your defense spending. You are inviting the Russians to basically walk across your borders if you're spending 1% of your GDP on defense instead of 2% of your GDP on defense. So that I thought was well founded by President Trump. And then President Trump also suggested that the Germans had basically been selling out their foreign policy to the Russians because former Prime Minister, former Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, who was the Chancellor of Germany up until Merkel took over, I believe, he has now become basically a Russian agent in Europe. He's been going around signing pipeline deals on behalf of Russian Gazprom, which is their giant Rosneft, which is their giant Russian oil company. And apparently he has been going around taking money for this, and some 70% of all natural gas imported into Germany is now coming via Russia, thanks to these pipelines, the Novo streams that have been coming into Germany from Russia. So Trump smacked them for that. He says, listen, you guys are yelling at me about colluding with Russia. You're the ones taking 70% of your natural gas from Russia, thanks to a former chancellor here who's signing all sorts of contracts with the Russians to sit on the board of their state-owned gas companies. Okay, that's founded too. So both of those criticisms, I think, were well-founded by President Trump. What is not particularly well-founded by President Trump is the idea that he is sort of anti-NATO. So there's an argument that's now going on over what President Trump said over at NATO. So according to Politico, quote, U.S. President Donald Trump threatened on Thursday to break with NATO and conduct American security unilaterally if allies do not rapidly meet higher spending targets, NATO officials and diplomats said. Officials inside the room for the formal session of the North Atlantic Council, the alliance's top political decision-making body, said Trump arrived late and apparently furious and quickly hijacked a meeting that was already in progress with the presidents of Ukraine and Georgia. Taking the floor, Trump unleashed what one official called a prolonged rant on spending. He warned of grave consequences if allies do not quickly ramp up their spending, sending the gathering into chaos. Trump also demanded that allies demonstrate how they would ramp up spending and warned that the U.S. could go our own way if they do not meet his demands. While some officials, including French President Emmanuel Macron, said Trump never overtly threatened to abandon NATO, others said they interpreted it as a clear threat. So Trump went in there, he used some vague language about how if they didn't do what they were supposed to do, bad things were going to happen. And people interpreted this as Trump saying that he was going to pull out of NATO entirely and leave the Europeans to their own devices, which would not be good, by the way. because you do want the EU acting as one, as a defense unit against Russia. One of the great developments has been NATO. You do want NATO to continue to be a vital player in world affairs. The last thing you want is a return to pre-NATO politics when Germany and France were going to war every 20 years or so, when Britain, Germany, France, Poland, Spain, Czechoslovakia, like all these various countries were going to war with one another on a regular basis. You would not prefer that to be the case. NATO helps prevent all of that because it aims the entire bloc basically against Russia. You don't want that to collapse in on itself. It's foolish for the president to be attempting to pull out of NATO if, in fact, that's something he did, although it's kind of unclear at this point that's what he did. So I'm going to give you the rest of the story in just a second. First, let's talk about your resume. So you need to make your resume better. The reality is whatever job you hold right now, the chances are very slim that you're going to be holding it in 10 years. And if you're ambitious, probably you shouldn't be holding it in 10 years. Probably you should be looking to at least increase your job title in the company you're at, or moving jobs to get a better salary. Well, the way to do that is to make your resume better, to increase your skill set. And that's where skills